Being very like-minded in their politics, Abraham and Mary became fast friends. They could talk together for hours and wrote letters to each other. They also found a shared experience through loss, as they had both lost their mothers when they were still young children. For many, though, these two seemed a very odd and wrongly matched pair. Personality-wise, and even in their childhood backgrounds, with Mary growing up in wealth and privilege, and Abraham growing up in poverty and still being poor in his adult life, they were largely opposites. Hello and welcome to the Civil War Project. My name is Carrie, and today's spotlight focus is on a place I cherish dearly, the Lincoln Home National Historic Site in Springfield, Illinois. On a cold winter day in March 1979, I was almost 3 years old and living in Springfield. We had relatives visiting from out of town, so we went to see two historical places, the first one being the Lincoln Home. If you ever wondered how early you can get a kid interested in something, I am living proof that it can start young, because it was this day that lit the fuse of my self-motivated journey to learn all I could about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Therefore, I felt it made sense to have my first spotlight video on a place that inspired me to learn and to see as much of our history as possible. Before I get into the details of the home and family life of the Lincolns, I would be doing you a huge disservice if I didn't first talk a little bit about the early years of Illinois and Springfield, which greatly influenced Abraham Lincoln and his journey to the presidency. There are a lot of cool things to talk about, so let's get started. Let's talk history. For hundreds of years in the Mississippi River Valley, there lived the Illinois, which consisted of about a dozen indigenous tribes. Their name translates to the best people. France was the first European country to claim title over the Illinois land in the mid-1600s, and using their own French translation of the name called it Illinois. It's that French pronunciation from the 1600s that we continue to use today, and it's why the S at the end of Illinois is silent. Unfortunately for the Illinois, by the early 1800s, their population in Illinois had been reduced to around 500. In 1832, the remaining Illinois would be moved to a reservation in Kansas after President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. Another thing the French introduced into the territory was implementation of their slave laws, which brought enslaved peoples into the region. Many worked in salt mines, which was the first major industry in this territory, but they also built structures and performed other manual labor tasks. Even though the territory would exchange hands a few times, first to the British and then under the umbrella of the new United States of America, new laws were made in the late 1700s to forbid slavery, and yet ways were found around them. The most common was the introduction of indentured servant contracts that bound people to work for a certain number of years in return for food and shelter. That might sound like an improvement, but the contracts could be for up to 99 years. Even in modern times, very few people lived to be 99, so this was still slavery, just under a different name that was legally permitted. In 1818, Illinois officially joined the United States as the 21st state. Congress was having a difficult time with slavery as the country continued to grow and more areas wanted to become states. This was before several compromises were legally made in the upcoming decades leading up to the Civil War. Unofficially, the idea was to balance the number of free states and slave states. Slave states allowed the horrific institution of slavery to remain legal. Free states, in theory, were states where slavery was not legally allowed. Because Mississippi had been admitted as a slave state a year before, and Alabama would also be admitted as a slave state a few weeks after Illinois, Illinois had to be admitted as a free state in order to keep the perceived balance of power. The reality is that the 1818 Illinois Constitution allowed for the continued use of indentured servant contracts. It also allowed for a certain number of enslavers to retain their enslaved persons for continued work in the salt mines. In the first General Assembly in 1819, the first black laws were passed, largely designed to deny African Americans basic rights of citizenship. They discouraged freedom seekers, or even free African Americans, from coming to the state. These black laws even made it legal for enslaved persons and indentured servants who were identified as disobedient or who were perceived to be not working hard enough, or if they were caught trying to organize, to receive punishment, up to 39 lashes. In 1829, new laws meant that free African Americans not only had to produce a certificate of freedom in excellent condition, even a small tear could make the document void, but they also had to pay $1,000 as assurance that they would follow the laws and not become a burden on the county. That equates to $32,000 today. It would take until 1848 for the Illinois Constitution to finally be updated and for slavery and indentured servitude to no longer be legal. However, in 1853, the state issued new black laws, largely in response to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act approved by the U.S. Congress, requiring enslaved persons to be returned to their owners if found in a free state. These new black laws were considered the harshest of any northern state. If any African American entered Illinois and stayed beyond 10 days, they would face a misdemeanor and large fines. If the fines could not be paid, the county sheriff could sell the individual's labor, turning the individual into a slave. These black codes would remain in place until the end of the Civil War in 1865. I say this because during Abraham Lincoln's life, slavery was one of the biggest topics of the day. I've often read how Abraham's only contact with the horrific institution of slavery was when he was in New Orleans, Louisiana on a job and witnessed a slave auction. However, there were men in Springfield and all across Illinois who had enslaved persons and who had indentured servants, and Lincoln knew some of these men and had interactions with them, given their high status and his occupation as a lawyer. Now, there were several notable abolitionists in Illinois during Abraham's time there, and there was an underground railroad to help bring enslaved peoples to freedom and safety as early as 1786. Those things would have impacted Abraham's views as well. He never supported the institution of slavery, and that would become a big part of his political speeches as he eventually ascended to the White House. Now, in 1818, most of the Illinois population resided in the southern third of the state. Early settlers didn't know what to make of this vast, treeless prairie to the north. They assumed that because there was a lack of trees there, that it meant that the land wouldn't be suitable for farming. It also meant that settlers wouldn't have the wood they would need to build their homes, furniture, tools, and other necessary items. For example, even a modest 16-foot by 20-foot, one-room log cabin, similar to what Abraham Lincoln spent his childhood in, would take 50 to 60 trees alone. For this reason, most people initially settled in the southern portion of the state, near or along its many rivers and streams, which were lined with those all-important trees. Illinois' first two capital cities, Kaskaskia, followed by Vandalia, were also in that same southern region. As for Springfield, in early 1819, a man named John Kelly built his cabin on what is now the corner of 2nd and Jefferson Streets. Several families, including John Kelly's parents, siblings, and their families, came from North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia and settled along a small clear stream that emptied into Spring Creek. It was this creek that the eventual town of Springfield would be named after. One of Springfield's earliest settlers included a 5-year-old enslaved boy named Jack. He would eventually be sold to another family, who then moved to the newly formed slave state of Missouri. By the late 1830s, Springfield's population was around 3,000. It was centrally located in Sangamon County, which was named for the Sangamon River that runs through it. There were stores, banks, tailors, and churches. There were also lawyers, as Springfield was the county seat. So now that you know a little bit of background about Illinois and Springfield, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is best known for being our 16th president, who led the country during a civil war and was assassinated just as that war was coming to a close. He grew up in rural, one-room log cabins in central Kentucky and southern Indiana, and his formal education amounted to less than a year. Abraham once summed up his childhood as the short and simple annals of the poor. His mother would die from illness when he was 9, leaving behind Abraham and his older sister Sarah. His father would remarry a widow with 3 children, and the two families were merged. Luckily, Abraham got along very well with his new stepmother. But he was still forced to provide labor for others starting in a very young age. All wages he earned would go to his father, which would help to provide for the entire family. In 1830, at the age of 21, he moved with his father and stepmother to central Illinois. He would set out on his own a year later at the age of 22, which is when he was legally allowed to keep wages earned for himself. As he entered this new stage of his life, he described himself as a strange, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy. Abraham spent the next 6 years in New Salem, Illinois, a small village 20 miles northwest of Springfield. He worked multiple jobs, often several at a time, such as surveyor and postmaster, and he unsuccessfully co-owned a general store, which also caused him a great deal of debt that would take him many years to pay off. In his free time, he started to self-study the law by borrowing law books from a lawyer in nearby Springfield. With his honesty, hard work, and great storytelling abilities, Abraham became a very well-liked figure in New Salem and really the region. Though he failed at his first attempt, his second attempt to be elected as a member of the Illinois State House of Representatives was successful at age 25. At this point, Abraham was a member of the Whig Party, which was one of two main political parties at the time, and was also the primary conservative party from the 1830s to the 1850s. While in his second term at the State House, Abraham was part of a group of Whig Party men called the Long Nine, due to their collective average height of 6 feet, which at the time was above the average height of a typical adult male. The state was seeing increasing population growth and expansion in northern Illinois because, as it turned out, the land was spectacular for farming. So, the Long Nine were successful in their bid to permanently move the state capital 72 miles north from Vandalia to a more centralized Springfield in 1837. For those who might wonder why Chicago was not considered or chosen, its geography is so far northeast that it didn't really meet the ideal qualification of being centralized. In addition, Chicago was officially granted a city charter by the state also in 1837, so those two issues just didn't make it a feasible option. Abraham would move to Springfield that same year, largely because the town of New Salem was quickly dwindling in population due to its lack of access to major transportation routes. All the self-studying in between jobs paid off, and Abraham was able to obtain a license to practice law. He became a junior partner in a local law firm and set up living arrangements as a boarder above a store owned by Joshua Speed, who would become one of his lifelong best friends. Still, he initially found Springfield's social scene daunting, writing, "This thing of living in Springfield is rather a dull business. I am quite as lonesome here as I ever was anywhere in my life." In the fall of 1839, Abraham met Mary Todd, a cheerful, energetic, and intelligent woman from a prominent, wealthy, and slave-owning family in Lexington, Kentucky, who was 10 years his junior. Mary came to Springfield to live with her oldest sister, Elizabeth, who was married to a prominent Illinois legislator and lawyer. They were also a big part of the Springfield social scene, which is a key reason why Mary moved there, to find a suitable husband. At a dance, Abraham saw Mary and worked up the courage to tell her that he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. Mary is said to have later told friends that he did just that, dance with her in the worst way. I can imagine it would have been very awkward simply by their height difference, the 6'4" Abraham towering over the 5'2" Mary. But she was still very taken with Abraham, and he was still very taken with her. Now, being very like-minded in their politics, Abraham and Mary became fast friends. They could talk together for hours and wrote letters to each other. They also found a shared experience through loss, as they had both lost their mothers when they were still young children. For many, though, these two seemed a very odd and wrongly matched pair. Personality-wise, and even in their childhood backgrounds, with Mary growing up in wealth and privilege, and Abraham growing up in poverty and still being poor in his adult life, they were largely opposites. For 3 years, they courted on and off, but eventually they married at Elizabeth's home on the evening of November 4th, 1842, by Reverend Charles Dresser, an Episcopal minister. Remember his name for a moment, because there is more to this story. The newly married Abraham and Mary Lincoln rented a room at the Globe Tavern, a boarding house just a few blocks from the new Illinois State Capitol building, at a cost of $4 a week. 9 months later, their first son, Robert, who was named after Mary's father, was born in August 1843. I think it's easy to imagine that a boarding house that is usually filled with men and very few women would not be an ideal place to have a crying infant as a boarder. So it makes sense that Abraham and Mary would start looking for a house. By that fall, they moved down the road to a small rented cottage home on South 4th Street. After Mary's father visited the young family for the first time, he gave his daughter money to help the new family along. The Lincolns would put the money towards a more permanent home. Now, I told you in part 1 to remember Reverend Charles Dresser, the minister that had married the couple. Well, it turns out that the Reverend had a 5-room, 1.5-story Greek Revival-style cottage home on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets, and he was looking to sell as the house had become too small for his large family. The Lincolns purchased the Dresser's white cottage home with green shutters, along with its lot, for $1,500, and the young family moved in on May 1st, 1844. This would become the only home that Abraham Lincoln ever owned. There were quite a few renovations that would transform the cottage into the house we see today. The first major remodel occurred almost immediately, shifting the kitchen further back to its present location and putting in its place a main bedroom and pantry. Because the upstairs level was only a half-story tall, there was no way the 6'4" Abraham would have been able to stand upright if they had used the existing bedroom on that level. In their new first-floor bedroom, their second son, Edward, nicknamed Eddie, was born in March 1846. Later that year in August, Abraham was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. The Lincolns were going to Washington. In the 2 years Abraham served, they rented out their Springfield home and stored their furniture upstairs. Abraham's time in the House of Representatives was unfortunately not very successful or memorable. To give you an idea of how Abraham felt about it, I think this story represents it best. Before Abraham left Washington, he had written a note to an autograph collector who had requested his signature with a sentiment. Abraham would reply, "I am not a very sentimental man. The best sentiment I can think of is that if you collect the signatures of all persons who are no less distinguished than I, you will have a very undistinguishing mass of names." It's a great example of Abraham's self-deprecating humor, but it also shows how he saw his time there as a bit of a disappointment. When they returned home to Springfield, there was a lot of sorrow that followed. Over the next few years, Mary and Abraham's fathers both passed away, along with Mary's grandmother. Their younger son, Eddie, became sick with pulmonary tuberculosis. After 52 long days, he died in the same room he was born in, just a month shy of his 4th birthday. His funeral was held in the front parlor of the home. Mary and Abraham were devastated. They both had so much loss throughout their life that this was really hard for them to handle, and it would take both of them years to process their loss in their own way. There was some joy, though, when 10 months later William, nicknamed Willie, was born, and 2.5 years later, in 1853, Thomas was born, named after Abraham's late father, but nicknamed Tad due to his big head and tiny frame at birth, which reminded Abraham of a tadpole. After Washington, Abraham put his political ambitions aside and threw himself back into his fairly new Springfield law practice, where he was now the senior partner. Because many small Illinois towns did not have local attorneys, it was necessary for people like Abraham to be part of what was called riding the circuit. A small group of lawyers, along with a judge, would travel through a set group of counties to provide legal services and hold trials. Abraham was a lawyer on the 8th Judicial Circuit, which was comprised of 15 counties in central Illinois. He enjoyed this time in his career, absorbing himself in his cases and enjoying the companionship of those he traveled with and met along the way. People would easily remember the tall man with the 7 to 8 inch stovepipe hat, who was a great storyteller and a very clever lawyer. The downside was that it left his wife Mary alone back in Springfield, where she had to manage the house and parent the children. At times he would be gone for as long as 2 months at a time, so it's not surprising that this was very difficult for his wife. Mary, who often had strong emotions and needed constant support, at times really struggled, especially when her husband was away so much. She had a fear of burglars and house fires, and was afraid to be alone by herself. She was also terrified of lightning and thunderstorms, which were very common in central Illinois. Abraham put lightning rods on top of the home as a protective measure, but there was little he could do about the rest of her fears while he was away for 6 to 8 months each year. This is where their oldest son Robert came in. With his playmate Eddie now gone, Robert's closest companion at home became his mother. They had a shared love of poetry, literature, and the French language, in which both were fluent. They took piano lessons together. With his father away, Mary looked to Robert as the man of the house, and he performed the chores Abraham would normally do if he were home. And when Robert wasn't away at school, he became the person Mary looked to protect her from those things she feared, especially at night. Even at a young age, she had the ability to calm her nerves and help make her feel safe. This would remain incredibly important years later after Abraham's assassination. Still, some in the town thought Mary was unpredictable and mentally unstable. She would have outbursts of anger, often directed at Abraham, who usually brushed it off. He knew she had good in her heart, and that after her outbursts, she often felt great shame and remorse. On the other side, many in town also saw her as someone capable of great kindness to friends and neighbors, and she was incredibly loyal to her husband and their children. It was common for middle-class families to have hired help, and the Lincolns were no exception. To provide help for Mary, they hired girls as young as 8 and women as old as 75 to help with the cooking, laundry, and sewing, as well as helping to take care of the children and other manual labor tasks. Early on, some even helped teach Mary how to complete typical household chores, as she had grown up with enslaved people doing the work. This included cooking and baking. The girls and women came from various backgrounds, from Irish to Portuguese to African Americans. They would make $1 to $1.50 a week, minus any expenses such as room and board. In the mid-1850s, there was a great expansion of the railroads in the northern states, including Illinois. Abraham began acting as an attorney for several of the railroad companies, with much of the work taking him to Chicago during the week. This improved income source meant that he didn't have to travel as much on the circuit. The hundreds of miles of railroad track also meant that he could now come home on the weekends to help his wife and to spend time with their children. Also during this time, there were additional remodels and expansions of the home, not just to support their growing family, but also to reflect Abraham's career success as a lawyer and newly re-sparked ambitions as a politician. A stove was added to the parlor room. The front wooden sidewalk was replaced with bricks, and the brick retaining wall in front of the home was constructed. It was after living in the home for 12 years that they completed the biggest remodel, and the end result is what visitors see today. In 1855 to 56, approximately 5 years before Abraham would be elected president, they raised the house from 1.5 stories to 2 stories. All the bedrooms would now be on the second floor, and they converted the first floor bedroom into a rear parlor with beautiful wooden doors that could be closed for privacy. A wall was also put in to separate the kitchen from the small dining room. At some point, the house was also painted a light brown with green shutters, similar to the colors we see on the home today. The Lincoln home would become a very popular and notable household in Springfield, and eventually to the rest of the country when Abraham became the Republican Party's candidate for president in 1860. Some of you might be thinking, hey, wasn't he a Whig? Well, he was, until the 1850s when the Whig Party faded and the newly formed Republican Party, who took stronger stances against slavery, became the one Abraham and countless others now supported. So, obviously Abraham won the highly charged 1860 presidential election, where slavery dominated as the most important issue. Abraham was one of 4 candidates. He won with only 39% of the popular vote, but he did have the majority of electoral votes, 180 out of 303. He did not win a single southern slaveholding state, and it didn't take long before those states started to secede from the Union, forming their own country, which they called the Confederate States of America. After the election, the Lincolns opened their doors to Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which printed detailed illustrations of the various rooms in their home. The newspaper wanted to show the home of this new president who had grown up in one-room log cabins. These illustrations would be incredibly helpful to modern-day historians and preservationists, allowing them to decorate and arrange the home for current visitors so it closely reflects what it looked like back in 1860. When the Lincolns moved to the White House, they rented the home out to Lucien Tilton, a railroad executive who also purchased most of the Lincoln furniture. When Abraham was assassinated, the Tiltons accommodated hundreds of mourners who wanted to visit the house, who often took a blade of grass or a leaf off a tree as a keepsake. But when people started taking paint off the clapboards and bricks from the retaining wall, they had to ask for military protection. The Tiltons moved to Chicago a few years later and brought a lot of the Lincolns' furniture with them, but unfortunately much of what they had was lost in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Mary and eldest son Robert continued to rent out the home. None of the remaining Lincoln family members, which at this point was just Mary, Robert, and Tad, as Willie had died when they lived at the White House, would ever live there again. Due to continued public interest in the home, one of the renters, Osborn Oldroyd, eventually turned the home into a Lincoln museum and charged admission. Osborn would eventually move several items, such as the Lincoln Boy's cradle and Mary's cast iron stove, to the Peterson House in Washington, D.C., where Abraham had died after being shot at Ford's Theater across the street. Osborn had outright stolen these items, but he also legitimately purchased a variety of Lincoln possessions and memorabilia over the years. He eventually sold about 3,000 items to the U.S. government for $50,000. Those items were then moved across the street to Ford's Theater. About 25 items from that collection were eventually returned to the Lincoln home and are still in good condition. Ironically, we have Osborn to thank for now having access to such things, even if he did so under very dubious circumstances. In 1887, Robert Lincoln deeded the house to the state of Illinois for just $1, but he had two conditions. One, that the state would maintain the property, and two, that there would be no charging the public for access. Let's just say that Robert was not thrilled when he found out that Osborn had been charging admission while also not paying rent. The home would remain in the state's possession until 1972, when the federal government assumed control and made it the national park that it is today. So, what are some of my favorite things about the Lincoln Home National Historic Site? Let's start from the beginning. As you stand in front of the house and make your way up the steps, you must take note of the sign on the front door that reads A. Lincoln. It's a replica, but I find it to be a very important reminder that you are literally walking into a place that the Lincolns called home for 17 years. Once inside, there is a bell by the door that serves as a doorbell, which is authentic to the home. There is also a coat and hat rack, which was likely one of the first things the family purchased. I think it's easy to miss as it's in the hallway area below the stairs. As you walk through the entire home, notice the bold wallpaper and carpet patterns. While one might think that there are some odd pairings, back then it was a popular trend to have what was called harmony through contrast. Notice that on some of the wallpapers there are specks of gold. This is to help reflect the light from the candles that would have helped to make the room brighter. The horsehair furniture in the parlor rooms is what really caught my attention as a child, probably because one of the couches was right at my eye level. Some of these are pieces from the Lincoln family, and they are in excellent condition. A lot of important conversations took place while important people sat on that furniture. If you want to know what horsehair furniture feels like, they actually have a touch display in the visitor center. It gives everyone a chance to safely touch things like the horsehair or even the doorknobs so that you don't feel tempted to do so while in the home. Also in the front parlor is a beautiful wooden whatnot and knickknacks that belong to the family. And be sure to check out the wooden doors in between the parlor rooms. The rear parlor is where Abraham officially received the Republican nomination for president, so you can take a few seconds to ponder what that must have felt like in that moment. Also, just a quick reminder that that back parlor is where the original bedroom was. It's where the last three boys were born and also where second-born Eddie had passed away. The dining room is small but pleasant. Despite their small home and modest household budget, Mary was known for throwing entertaining and enjoyable small parties and gatherings, and she excelled in conversation and in making people feel welcome. These gatherings would have taken place in the parlors and in the dining room. On a small side table is her famous white almond cake, and you can also see it from the kitchen as well. A link to the recipe is in the description. I love that the Park Service has that there, especially because she didn't know how to cook or bake initially, but became so good at it that she actually did become known for it. The sitting room is where the family spent time together. Mary would often be sewing or reading as the young children played. The wooden cane chair was her favorite spot to feed her baby boys and rock them to sleep. If Robert was home from school, as he was away quite a bit, getting the education that Abraham probably wished he had had for himself as a child, he likely sat in one of the chairs studying or partaking in more adult things. There are some toys from back in the day that are in excellent condition, including a stereoscope, which is a viewfinder where you could view photos in 3D. These are replicas that show the type of toys that the kids would have played with. Often Abraham would stretch out on the floor, playing with the boys or reading books or law briefs. Occasionally, there would be a cat or two, because Abraham loved a good stray cat and often brought them home, content in playing with them for hours, much to Mary's dismay. I can feel the joy in this room, and one can imagine the immense satisfaction that Abraham and Mary must have had when spending time together here as a family. When you go upstairs via the front of house stairway, go slowly and grab the railing, because the railing is original to the house, so you're actually touching the same railing the Lincolns did. When you get upstairs, to the left is a guest room, but it also served as Robert's room when he was home from school. It's the only room that has wooden shutters. There's a small space at the top of the stairs that was likely used by Mary or the hired help when sewing, as it provides great light from the big window. As was often custom in middle to upper class families, Abraham and Mary each had their own bedroom. In Abraham's room, the bed was not his, but it is the appropriate size he had to fit his tall frame. The wardrobe and dresser belonged to Abraham, along with the small desk in the corner. The desk is my favorite piece in this room, and it has a great story behind it. Abraham purchased it around 1844 when he began to do business for himself. He eventually brought it home to his new second-floor bedroom. He continued to use it to write letters, legal briefs, and political speeches, until one day he accidentally knocked over an inkwell. The desk is quite small in comparison to his physical characteristics of long, lanky arms and legs and large hands, so can we blame him? This little spill, though, unfortunately caused one of Mary's famous outbursts of anger, and she threw it out. Abraham secretly rescued it and gave it to a neighbor to repair and use. So now it's back in the home, minus the ink stain. Mary's bedroom is special because it has limited light. This was on purpose because she unfortunately suffered from debilitating migraine headaches. This meant she had a comfortable place in the home to retreat to during these spells. The beautiful chest of drawers dates back to her time in Kentucky from her childhood home in Lexington. Willie and Tad's bedroom is simple and sparse, which makes sense because the boys were said to be highly active and often out of control. While they slept in this room, the best feature to them was the window that allowed them to crawl out onto the roof. From the roof, they caused much mischief and grief to fellow Springfieldians below. Abraham and Mary did not believe in punishing their children, so this behavior was never corrected. The room where the hired girls lived is also sparse and by the back staircase, which then leads to the kitchen. Here, you have to take notice of the beautiful stove and oven that is in mint condition. Abraham must have felt so proud to be able to buy for his wife such a beautiful new stove for her cooking and baking needs. I'm also really glad this piece was brought back to the home where it belongs. Overall, when you think about how Abraham grew up in one-room log cabins, or when you think about how even in adulthood how he shared rooms or stayed at boarding houses, this beautiful 3,100 square foot home that he was able to live in for 17 years, far longer than any other place in his life, must have been very fulfilling for him, along with giving him a great feeling of stability. I think the choices the couple made in regards to the layout and decor says a lot about what the couple prioritized in their life and also what was most meaningful to them. Once you're back outside the home, there is this wonderful historic neighborhood you can now walk through. That wasn't there when I was a kid, but I think it's a wonderful addition, and it really allows you to feel like you've gone back in time. Downtown Springfield itself is full of history, and it's a fairly easy place to walk around, especially on a good weather day. If you want to do something really cool, the neighborhood is actually open from dawn until dusk. So, if you can make the time work for you, I found it really wonderful to visit the neighborhood during off hours. It's a safe, quiet space. There are also benches near the Lincoln home that you can sit on, and it's the best experience to just take it all in with minimal noise or commotion. One evening, just before dusk, my husband and I sat on the bench as the lights started turning on. I thought of Mr. Lincoln coming home at night and how he probably could hear the sound of his children and maybe even the voice of his wife as he approached the house. I imagined him walking up to the home the night he was elected president, and I wondered if he sprinted up the steps and threw open the door, or did he hesitate, thinking about the insurmountable task before him, before slowly opening the door to tell Mary. I could even feel how much his heart had to hurt as he looked at his beautiful home one last time before he would leave for Washington, knowing there was a good chance he may never see it again. And he never did. I think being at a place of historical significance when there are minimal people can really connect you to a site in a different way, and I would highly suggest you take advantage of situations like this when possible, because I think they're the most memorable. So, what do you need to know for your visit to the Lincoln home? Thanks to Robert Lincoln, the Visitor Center home and neighborhood are free of charge. It is under the National Park Service umbrella, which means it's also part of the Junior Ranger program through the NPS that aims at 5 to 13-year-olds. There is a Visitor Center parking lot located on South 7th Street, which does cost $2 an hour, which you pay at an automated gate when you leave either by credit or debit card. However, as of June 2023, metered street parking throughout downtown Springfield is free, as they are in the process of streamlining and updating their parking meters. The most important thing is that while the visit is free, you still need tickets to view the home. Each tour is ranger-led and limited to 15 people, so tickets can go quite quickly, especially March through November. On the busiest days, they can run out by early afternoon, so even if you want to go later in the day, I would still try to stop by early to secure tickets for the time you prefer. The Visitor Center opens at 8:30 a.m. and closes at 5 p.m. The first tour is at 9 and the last one begins at 4:30. There is a film in the Visitor Center titled Abraham Lincoln, A Journey to Greatness, which is 23 minutes long. It can also be viewed on their YouTube page if you wish to view it ahead of time. I've put the link in the description. For those who can't make the trip to Springfield in the near future, this is one way to experience things remotely. At the start of your tour time, you'll meet at the Visitor Center, not the house. Be sure to check out the touch display in the lobby, and if you like a good souvenir, they do have a great gift shop filled with a variety of books, clothing, trinkets, etc. You'll need to show your tickets to your tour guide, but they are yours to keep as a souvenir. The ranger will give a brief introduction, and then as a group, you'll head to the home. The first floor is handicapped accessible. The second floor is not, so please visit their website or call for more information. The tour itself is about 30 minutes, with about 20 of those minutes inside the home. It will go by very quickly. There's minimal time for questions in the home, but once you're outside again, the rangers are very good about sticking around and answering additional questions. Each ranger highlights some standard things along with some stories most interesting to them personally, so technically you get a different experience each time you go, which is great if you're like me and enjoy bringing family and friends for a visit. And yes, personal photography and videography is allowed. If you can't make the visit in the near future, Google Arts and Culture allows you to do a pretty cool tour of the home online. Also, the Lincoln Home YouTube channel has tours that you can view at any time. Links to both of these sites are listed in the description below. The Lincoln neighborhood is something you can visit before or after your tour. There's signage at each home that provides information about the Lincoln's neighbors. There's also a cool virtual reality-like app you can download and use at one of the homes, which is in the description. You can also go inside two of the homes. One is the Harriet Dean House, which has detailed displays showing models of the original 1.5-story cottage home, along with floor plans, and other models and signage reflecting those future Lincoln family renovations, many of which I've shown in this video. The second home is the Charles Arnold House, which focuses on the archaeology of these sites, along with how they go about restoring and preserving such old spaces. If you want to hit the major Lincoln spots in a single day, it is possible. There's the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, which gives a 5-star look at Abraham's life from start to finish, with special focus on the White House years. It's honestly a phenomenal experience, and be sure to also view the 2 theatrical presentations because they are something incredibly special. Please note that there is an admission charge for the visit. The other important must-see site is the Lincoln Tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery, where all of the Lincoln family is buried with the exception of Robert Lincoln, who is buried in Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. with his wife. The tomb is free of charge. There are also other sites and signage all over Springfield that talk about the various parts of Abraham's life. along with other historical events important to the city and its people that have lived there in its 200 plus years existence. To check out everything this capital city has to offer, check out their website, visit springfieldillinois.com. Lastly, I want to leave you with this because I think it will help you understand how Abraham felt about Springfield and its people. Right before he departed Springfield by train to Washington in February 1861, he spoke these emotionally charged words to those who had come to wish him well on his journey. "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place, and to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young to old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when, or whether ever, I may return, with a task before me greater than which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of the divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell." I hope that you found this video helpful. Always be sure to check online or call for verification of hours or any other necessary information before you visit. If you've been to the Lincoln home or to Springfield, what are your favorite things? Or do you have a Civil War location, person, or event you'd like me to spotlight? Let me know in the comments. Also, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and press that notification bell so you're notified when I post future videos. I hope you'll join me on this journey as we explore Civil War history one person, place, and event at a time. And as Abraham Lincoln would say, I bid you an affectionate farewell.